So, welcome everybody to this new series that we are in. I believe the prayer sheet is it's over here, and it's going to Sheldon. It's going to Sheldon. All right. So that's how it will be traveling this morning. Okay, so we want to welcome our guests. I believe Laconia has introduced them already, but welcome. Glad you're here this morning. This new series that we are starting today, it's called Reading the Bible After the Holocaust, or the other name that is used for the Holocaust is the Shoah, which means great disaster. So it's a much more encompassing term of the things that happened than simply the Holocaust, which refers more to the burning. Right? If it's a Greek term that you will find in the Old Testament, the Greek version of the Old Testament, which the Holocaust is a word that means burnt offering, right? And so that's where that word came from. Sort of a newer term that's used is the Shoah, which includes not only what happened with the Jews, but also many other people groups in that time period, right? So I use them interchangeably because in the literature in the subject, it's also used interchangeably. But that's just by way of introduction. You may wonder, why do this? Why study the Bible this way? And in particular, in this class, we're going to confine our study to the book of Genesis. Simply because that's where many stories are that lend themselves very well to this way of reading. I got into this way of reading in my doctoral work about 25 years ago, when people were just beginning to realize that we need to find a way to look at sacred text, not just the Bible, but any sacred text. We need to learn to look at that, or we need to explore how to look at a sacred text in light of humanitarian disaster, right? We are, in terms of the Holocaust, we are 80 years out in 2025. The liberation of Auschwitz, which is sort of tends to be kind of the marker, which was in January of 1945. We are at 2025. So we are a generation out, right, of that particular disaster. And so as Primo Levi, who was an Auschwitz survivor, and he is also a writer, has been a great voice and proponent in Holocaust education, which actually came very late to the subject of theology. And that's, of course, that's my field. But one of the things that Primo Levi has written about is simply this: if it happened once, it can happen again. Right? The humanity has the ability to do really awful things. And if we don't take note of it, then I'm sure, as you've heard, history repeats itself, right? When that kind of evil is unleashed, then we get some really horrific results, and that's been true throughout history. And one of the things that I will show you in a minute, but I want to acknowledge, because this is something very important to acknowledge in this particular field of study, is that the Holocaust was not the only humanitarian disaster on a wide scale, right? There have been a number of genocides in the 20th century. I've listed the ones on the back. If you look at the back of your sheet, this is a list of genocides that have been officially recognized as such since 1900, right? And so you can see that you'll probably, if you're a history buff, you probably recognize pretty quickly there's some things that aren't on here. the Cultural Revolution in China, Mao Zedong's purges, some of the Stalin purges, and there's also other things that are not on here. I didn't put them on here because um, they did the definition of a genocide is the proven intent to exterminate a group of people based on national, ethnic, or religious beliefs. There's a very particular definition of what genocide means. And as I'll show you in a minute, there are several other um, designations such as crimes against humanity, human rights violations, all of these things into which other disasters fit. So I'm going to be particularly kind of picky here to confine, just for the sake of time and discussion, right? We'll be talking about genocide in this class. You'll also notice the very last one on the page is Gaza. And that has South Africa was the first country to actually name what's happening in Gaza as a genocide. Loads of discussion around that. I just returned from the International Association of Genocide Scholars international meeting in South Africa last week. This was an enormous topic. And so you may have lots and lots of questions about that. And I'll be glad to talk about some of those. But for the sake of this particular class, we're going to focus on genocide, which is the intent, right? There's a level of intent you have to prove for killing a group of people, not individuals, but a group of people. All right. So with that in mind, I want us to think about what do we want to get out of this? In other words, what are the reasons for looking at the Bible in this way? And I will say that this is a fairly new area of study in the field of biblical studies. The first book that came out on it to really address it was in 1990, right? So we're talking about what, maybe 30 years? And in the field of biblical studies, that's not very long, right? So this is still fairly recent. But the idea is, first of all, it's an act of justice, right? To bring that sensibility to reading the script, to the scripture, right? It honors the dead. It recognizes the dead. It recognizes that what happened on a large scale was wrong, that it was inhumane, that it was unjust, and that if as human beings we don't realize it and address it, it can happen again, and it doesn't happen overnight, right? This is something that ramps up gradually, and we'll talk about that. And then more importantly, what does the Bible have to say about it? How does the Bible address this? Does it address this? And if so, how does it do that? I would say that this act that we're doing right now of taking time to look at what Scripture has to say about this kind of a humanitarian disaster, the wrong that was done, is an act that counters indifference. At the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, Marian Tursky, who was an Auschwitz survivor, is a Polish Jew, very influential in being sure that Poland remembers what happened on Poland's soil, gave the address at the 75th anniversary. And his address was entitled The 11th Commandment, Thou shalt not be indifferent. And of course, all going back to the Ten Commandments, right? A very, very familiar frame for how human beings should treat each other. Adding this 11th one because his view was that unless people remember and actively do something and be vigilant, this can happen again. That the one of the real problems is not hate, it's indifference, just not caring. Having the attitude, well, yeah, that happened back then, but what does that have to do with me? Right, that kind of a thing. Um, if you would like to read his book on that, which is a very easy book, I can get that for you. But it's, I think my sense of responsibility, right, as a biblical scholar and teacher and dean of a school, right, is to bring this sensibility to students, right, is to say this is important, right? We need to recognize it and then do what we can. The other thing this sensitivity does is it reads for the suffering. I remember, and while I always remember this because it was something that happened when I was first a minister, very, very brand new, minted pulpit preacher. I was right about Cynthia's age actually when this happened. So welcome, Cynthia, to preacher world, right? We are here to support you 100%. But I remember there was a group of guys in our church that wanted to get together and do a men's retreat. You know what the topic was they wanted to do? This was 25 of them. Men, Bible heroes. Well, that sounds pretty. I mean, like what? I yeah, maybe, but then it's like, well, I mean, where are the women? Not there. Right? First of all, who are we talking about? Right? But what that did is it said, if we're always reading for the heroic, what about all those who are not heroic? If we're always reading for the elected, what about the people that aren't elected? Right? If we're always reading for Isaac, what about Ishmael? Right? Or if you're always reading about, the through line, right? The salvation history, right? You're always reading for the line of people, but what about all those other people? What about them? What about the Canaanites? What about the Ammonites? What about the Edomites? What about them? Right? Well, it's if we read over all of these people, we're missing a huge part of the story, right? And so this reading reads for the suffering. The other one, what happened to sorry, technology here is making a problem. I think ultimately this reading interrogates, well, how do we love our neighbor? How do we do that? What does that look like? Right? If there is someone nearby, how do we see them first? Right? And then how do we help them? And I think here about the numerous stories of people during the Holocaust who risked their lives to save people. Right. I mean, and this goes all the way from, anecdotes to real acts of sacrifice on the part even of churches and pastors, right? There were a lot of people whose stories still haven't been told, right, on how they risked their lives to help their neighbors. So we're going to talk about that. And then the other thing is that when we learn to read this way, I think it starts making our stories visible, right? And we're going to talk about that a little bit today when we talk about the kind of the first issue that comes up in Scripture about isolation and belonging, and why that is important. I want to talk a little bit about today why storytelling is so important, why it's important to tell our stories, right? Why it's important to humanize other people by listening to their stories. And that it can be an act of dehumanization to never invite someone to tell their story, right? When someone tells their story, they're made visible, right? You get to hear them, you get to listen to them, you get to find out about who they are. All of a sudden, right, there's a real person that God made sitting in front of you that has a story and has all this wonderful stuff to tell, right? The whole act of genocide is an attempt to erase people, right? If we boil it down to the essence, right? What's happening is there's an intent to say this whole group of people over here should not live. And so we will kill them. We intend to do that. We don't want to hear them. We want to erase them. We don't want to hear their stories. We want to remove everything about them. And this happens over and over again, right? And so one way to be sure that well, not be sure, but one way to address that is the other side of that, is making people visible, right? Which, by the way, this church is really good at, right? All right. Bottom line, this is sort of my thing. The way we learn to read the Bible is the way we learn to treat people, right? We learn to read Scripture for what it says about love and connection and humanity and inclusion and welcoming, right? And being affirming and being for people, learning about them, right? If we learn to read the Bible that way, we're going to see it differently than if we read it as a system of, law and exclusion, right? So how we learn to approach it is going to have an impact on how we learn to treat other people. All right, so my acknowledgement we've already done. We've already looked at all of these other incidents. So all of these are in mind, right? Not just the Holocaust, but all of this is in mind during our class. And I'll, again, bring this up again just a little bit later. We've talked about genocide, the intent to exterminate all or in part. Also, crimes against humanity, which developed at the same time, right, is more the individual. So if we look at what happened in the wake of the end of World War II, the years 1947, 1948, 1949, the Nuremberg trials, the tribunals, bringing people to justice, there were essentially three categories that emerged. The first one was Raphael Lemkin, who named and invented the word genocide, right, which has to do with the intent to erase a group, right? At the same time, another colleague of his, Hal Schlotterkopf, developed the concept of crimes against humanity, right? And this is more the individual. There is yet another thing that developed, the universal human rights, that the United Nations developed 17 different things that should apply to every human being that exists on the planet. And this 17 you can find in any UN, right? All of the world UN places. You can go to New York, you can go to Vienna, you can go to Kenya. These are, and when you have the celebration of human rights, the certain days that are, these are things that all people should have. And we don't have time to do it today, but if you can categorize all these into groups which will actually mirror the 10 Commandments. The ethic of the 10 Commandments is embedded in all of this, right? It's very interesting, right? How that works. All right, so what are we going to notice? There's 8 things that I want to cover in the class. One each week. We're going to start today with isolation and belonging. We're going to talk about responsibility. What does it mean to survive? Labor, building projects, choiceless choices. What do you do when you have a choice, but the choices aren't really a choice. The importance of intergenerational memory. Gets into storytelling, and also noticing who's missing, right? It's amazing what happens when you look at a biblical story and you look at who's not there. We know who's there, but who isn't there, or who disappears in the middle of the story, right? This is the lived experience of people during the Holocaust. People just disappeared, right? We kind of have that problem today, right? People disappearing. Where are they? Where'd they go? What happened? Right. So we're going to look at that. And then, of course, the issue of deception. Is deception always wrong? How is deception? It's like a double edge, right? It's like how you find it all over the Old Testament stories. Jacob, just deceiver. I mean, this is a very interesting topic, right? That we'll talk about as well. But today we're going to start with the isolation and the belonging. All right, so we're going to go to Genesis 2, and we're going to look at the first thing that God says isn't good. What is it? Being alone. Yeah, this whole idea of isolation. Not good. You ever thought about God making something and then realizing, oops, it's not good, right? What's the first thing we know about God? The very, very, very first attribute we know about God. What is it? In the beginning, God created. The very first verb that's used in Hebrew scripture is bara, which is to create, right? God is a creator. I'm going to push that. God is an artist, right? God is an innovator. God brings newness, right? And by the way, this is just really fun, I think. The verb bara, which means to create, is only used of God in the Hebrew Bible. To make, to form, to build, those are all things that God does, and human beings do that too. But in terms of that very first verb, to create, right? It's only used of God, bara, right? Interesting that the verb to bless is barak with a K at the end, right? And when you're doing Hebrew work, you want to notice when words relate to each other because you're supposed to relate the concepts. So the blessing, barak, has something to do with creation. So is it a surprise that human beings are blessed to what? Procreate. Human beings get to remake when you have the generations, right? So if you're blessed and you have kids, right, and you have more of them, the blessing isn't necessarily a good thing, right? Because when you read about blessings in the Old Testament, sometimes they're not, it doesn't sound like a blessing. It sounds like that's not going to go very well. Look at the sons of Jacob, right? Some of those are kind of grisly, right? Ishmael was blessed, right? But yet that blessing is problematic at best. But the blessing really has a lot to do with humans being imbued with that ability to create. So before that even gets started, right, and you have the first human being made, it's not good. So it's the first thing that needs to be addressed. And when you're an artist, the one thing you know is that when you make something, what do you often need to do? Every writer knows this. Is your first draft ever the best? No, and there's a term for it, and I won't use it in church. Huh? You got to rewrite, right? If you're a potter and you're working on a wheel, right? Is your first pot that you make perfect? No, right? So there's refinement, there's remakes, right? And so when God, as artist, sees that this earth creature is alone, there needs to be something done to it. Now, why am I calling it earth creature? Your Bible probably says man in there or something like that. Well, the word for dirt in Hebrew, like go out and go into that beautiful garden that Frank tends so well, go in and grab a handful of dirt. That's Adamah in Hebrew. The term for the creature is the ha, which is the ha Adam, the dirt, the thing from the dirt, the earth person. It's not gendered. It's a dirt person, right? And if you want to really go the distance with the dirt creature, right? This is the origin of superheroes, right? Because the early versions of what eventually became Frankenstein, right? Where you're making these creatures, right? They're made from they're essentially folk tales originating from Jewish lore, right? That have to do with making something out of the dirt, and it comes alive with a breath, right? It all ties together. So you have this dirt creature that has life and breath. It's living, but it's alone. Now, why is it alone? Well, it's alone because it was taken from its original substance, right, and made into something else. And that must have been amazing to see that first creature, right? But it was alone. And God looks at it and says, that's not, isolation is not good, right? So from this first Ha-Adam, right, there is a process by which it's separated and made into two differentiated parts that make a whole. And those are gendered, the ish and the isha, right? So now you have gender. So is it a surprise then that when we have human beings, there's this sense of biological male and biological female and everything kind of in between, right? Because it's all coming from the same source, right? So in that first story, we typically go to that story and think, oh, well, this is where men and women come from, right? This is, the marriage ceremony and all of this kind of thing. But the essence of why that story is there isn't generated because God feels like there needs to be a wedding somewhere. The problem that generates the making and the differentiation of the male and the female, and they're in the community, is solving this problem of aloneness. Community. We all need community, right? That's the key, right? The issue then, right? Now that we have from isolation, we now have community, we now have belonging, we now have a place, right? Notice in here there was some experimentation with the whole animal thing, right? That would be a great Netflix series. I mean, that experimentation is so typical, or not typical, it's so consistent with artistry. When you're trying to fashion something new, you're going to try some stuff, right? And then from that comes this sense of male and female, and now we have belonging. All right, so what is it that is so insidious about this whole process of genocide? Genocide is the attempt to destroy not just the person, but the community. Right. It's not just getting rid of one or two people. It's getting rid of a group. And when you get rid of a group, you get rid of community. Dr. Gregory Stanton, right, who's this, I actually had the privilege of meeting him last week, came up with what is now recognized to be the path to genocide, right? If you go into any Holocaust museum or genocide education program, you're going to find this. It begins with classification. What classification is, this is the first step. And again, genocide doesn't happen overnight, right? It happens over time, going through this process, right? What happens when you classify is you start separating people according to some characteristic that is threatening, right? Before you even put a symbol on it, so before, for example, in the Holocaust, before there were ever was ever the Jewish star, right? There was a whole system of how do we classify people so we can get people to be to want to get rid of them, right? Well, you do it by finding out that which is not like you. So I want to take you back to the fourth grade to illustrate what I mean by this, right? The fourth grade is where I learned long division. You remember long division when you first start and you have to divide a number by another number? Remember that? And so let's take the number 20 and you divide it by 5. What do you get? 4. And that's a nice, neat answer, right? There's no remainder. Okay, so now let's take 20 and let's divide it by 6. What do you get? 3.33333333 on into infinity. Remember that number pi? 3.14162, right? Remember that? There's a subway station in Vienna that when you get off of it, it has pi with the first 100 digits of remainder. That's what you get to look at on your way up to the street. It's fabulous. It's worth going to Vienna just to see that. But the whole point is, if I try to divide you by me, what's there always going to be? Remainder, right? I can't divide you by me and get a whole number because you're like me a little bit. You're like me 20 divided by 6, 3 worth. But there's an infinite amount of other remainder, right? Genocide is an attempt to pretend that remainder doesn't exist. We only want a society that's like us, that divides evenly, and everything else that's different, we're going to get rid of that, right? So you can, we maybe like each other in terms of maybe the neighborhood that we live in or the something that we like or the language that we speak. But we're different in terms of religious beliefs. We're different in terms of skin color. We're different in terms of background. We're different in terms of political beliefs. We're different in terms of just pick something, right? And so when people are classified according to something which the powers that be don't want, or that they believe that the society will reject, right? Then you have the basis for classification. Now, what does that look like? And what has that been look like? Okay, so go back to the sheet on the back. Right? one thing that all of these genocides have in common is classifying people on the basis of a threat to the body. If you go back into any of the literature of any of these events, you're going to find propaganda that linked the target group to something that threatened the health of the body. For example, parasites, vermin, cancers, tumors, viruses, cockroaches, worms, bacteria, infestation, rats. People are now tied. People are like this. Right? Well, who wants to be associated with something like this? Right? You don't want a parasite, that's dangerous. Right? This turns people into dangers. And if you say it enough, right? If you say it once, people could probably maybe brush it off. But when you have film, radio, television, newspapers, pamphlets bombarding people with this, there is research now that we can show that there is a certain part of the brain that starts to turn off if you hear it enough. And it's the part of your brain that is responsible or that handles empathy. Right? And if I remember next week, I will bring my brain picture to show you exactly where it is, because the research is fascinating, because when you look at hate speech, which all of these have in common, this kind of bodily threat is what will engage people to repel another group of people. There it's natural. So let me give you an example. We're gonna have, I think we have a meeting after church. There's going to be food here. I hope. Somebody comes along and says, don't eat those brownies, they have dirt in them. What would you do? You can't see it. But somebody who was reputable told you that. So what are you going to do? Eat the, I mean, some of us probably would eat it. You know. Huh? Ask, yeah, see, there you go. Right? All of a sudden, this starts to work its way in. Everybody seen the movie The Help? No. There's that famous scene with the brownies. So, fear of contamination, associating with disgust and bodily expulsion, advanced by influential persons. These are the three things that build towards genocide. Now, my point in bringing this up is that if you know what causes disintegration, you have a clue as to how to reintegrate, right? So flip this, right? And the way to humanize people is through not fear of contamination, but a blessing of being associated with, right? Not associated with disgust, but associated with something that is helpful and good and useful, right? And having these kind of messages advanced by influential people. Like, it is good to be with this group. It is good to be with diversity. It is good to learn from someone who is different. You see what I'm saying, right? It is good to hear another person's story, right? It is helpful for integrating people and helping them belong if we find ways to affirm as opposed to justify ways to exclude, right? Does that make sense? And I don't have to tell you that writ large, religion has been internalized by many people in the world as justifying exclusion. It could not be more unchristian, right? Because that over time is the thing that begins to justify excluding a group of people and going past those other stages, right? The first story in the Bible dealing with two human beings, right, is about fixing the problem of isolation, right? It's not good. We have to fix that. What is the next story about people about? Murder. See, this is absolutely why we need to talk about this, because you've got the purposes of God versus what humans are like, side by side, right off the bat. There are no chapters of flowery, beautiful language about how wonderful the earth is and how beautiful it is, right? It's all about the grisly stuff that starts it out, right? And that was one of the first questions I was ever asked in one of my biblical interpretation courses. Why does the Bible start the way it does? We're going to get into this, right? Because there's, all right, so let me, rehumanizing, seeing, celebrating difference, pursuing reconciliation, hearing and telling our stories. Right? This is an act of countering, right, the othering that's out there. Now, this may not seem like a lot, right? But one of the things that I am really sensitive to is we live in a world that bombards us constantly with negative images, and they're really good at it, right? How do we, as the people of God, counter that, right? That's really my question, right? That's really my lesson for this morning, right? And these are the things that, as we look through the literature of how do victims who survive attempts at genocide, what do they tell as advantageous to them? And one of the biggest ones that comes up, right, are these last two. Pursuing reconciliation, getting someone who's in the room who's different than you, and getting to know them. And then hearing and telling stories. Now, here's something about learning and telling stories. And I'll ask a question. If you were a survivor of genocide, how long, let's say that you saw your whole family senselessly murdered or abused or bullied, you can pick anything. How long do you think, according to the research, how long do you think it might take you to be able to actually talk about that? Not say that it happened, but actually talk about it. Just a guess.
10 years.
10? Yeah, on average about 20. When you're talking about sexual abuse, right, which is related to this, there's a gap, there's a difference of about 10 years between how long it takes for a woman to tell her story and for a man to tell his story. The man is longer. The average for males is about 28 to 30 years. Right. So storytelling isn't an immediate fix. And here I want to draw the distinction between the nature of evil and the nature of good. The nature of evil is fast and reckless. Right. The nature of good is slow and patient. So this speaks to the importance of building relationships with people. Again, something in my experience, this church is really good at that, right? And it's those relationships over time, right? And the trust that's built over time that helps people heal, right? We're a community of healing, and that will take time. So I know we're right out of time, but I did have some questions for us to think about. I'm going to be putting these up every week. Right. So how do we share our humanity through celebrating diversity? How can we help our speech build unity? What are ways within our power to rehumanize those that have been dehumanized? Right. So this won't be the last time that we see these, but we do have time, I think, for a couple of Scott.
I think it's really important. So you kind of intimated, how do we actually do this rehumanizing thing?
Mm-hmm.
I think what's critical is that people understand it's not a nice to have. It's necessary for our survival. For our survival. And if you want a biological example of that, diversity in biology is what saves species.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you look at what we do with monocultures, bananas, all of a sudden bananas are threatened all over the world because we have a monoculture of bananas all over the world. And a particular disease comes and it wipes out everything because there's no diversity in the kind of bananas that people grow.
Mm-hmm.
To me, there's no more clear biological reference than that to the person who's different from you may end up saving your life someday.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really,
And often that was the case.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, yeah, I think, Julie?
I was gonna say, sometimes it's not easy to get to someone else's story because, at least they say that there's something that makes them different and you wanna know about it, you wanna understand it better. It's hard to ask about it. In the sense that you might even feel like you're calling them out for being different. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but it is an experience that I had recently. I thought I really want to understand this about this person,
Yeah.
but I thought I don't want to ask about it because it seems to draw more attention to the different.
Yeah, and what you just described was that human curiosity being, it's telling me it's time. But thank you. Yeah, it's great. We have one more and then.
Now there is a documentary on the Holocaust titled "Who Will Tell a Story?"
Yes.
And this shows you the risk that the Jewish community went to document what was happening to them in real time, and to answer the question as to whether or not deception is always bad. Well, they had to practice some degree of deception with the German officers to document the story, to preserve them, so the story can be told from their perspective as they did it.
Right.
It's a great documentary.
It is good. And the museum in Warsaw, the Jewish Historical Museum, has the canisters that all of those stories were put into. Yeah, that's a great documentary. Thank you for bringing that up. It's really good.
Name again?
Who will tell our story? Yeah, Laconia.
Sure. I was in Ireland 15, 20 years ago on the West Coast to meet Shawnees, storytellers of old. And I remember meeting Eddie Linehan, and I only had one question for the storytellers. Why is storytelling so important to Irish people? And I'll never forget his answer. Because of the English, if we lose our story, we lose ourselves. I've never forgotten.
It's great. Okay, Sheldon, we'll close this in prayer.